Okay, so let's pick up where I was cut off at the end of the last video about ossification. And again, I feel like the notes get really nitpicky, but if you are comfortable with this image and comfortable with the idea of the first primary ossification center makes the medullary cavity, and then the second marrow cavity forms, and then as growth progresses, the epiphyseal plate is that growth line, and eventually that those two cavities are going to merge when we see the growth end. And then that sixth picture is the adult bone with a single marrow cavity and a closed epiphyseal plate. So the cartilage is basically converting over to bone. That is what ossification means. Okay, so not only do we talk about bone growth in the fetus, but also in children, but ossification continues throughout life with the growth and remodeling of bones. So bones are growing in two directions, length and width. We would expect length, but we sometimes forget about the width. So bone elongation, we've talked about this in the previous video, happens at the epiphyseal plate. That is specifically the growth zone. There's hyaline cartilage, and the hyaline cartilage is being replaced by bone. And then there's also the metaphysis, which is the zone of transition, and it is facing the marrow cavity. So in that area, that can be broken down into 5 zones. I think this is hard to visualize under the microscope. There's a picture in your book, but I'll just be honest, for me, it's really hard. And so I'm okay with kind of summarizing here and knowing that there's kind of different areas of the process, but I think for me to expect you to be able to identify that microscopically would kind of be difficult. So I'm not going to do that, but I would be able to walk through these steps or these areas of where each step is occurring. So the hyaline cartilage that's furthest from the marrow cavity doesn't look like it's transforming into bone. It looks just like regular hyaline cartilage, and that's called reserve cartilage. And then in the zone of proliferation, those chondrocytes, which are the cells in the hyaline cartilage, are going to multiply, and they form columns of flat lacuna. And then in the zone of hypertrophy, they enlarge, and the matrix between the lacuna become very thin. And then in the next zone, and we're moving down, the zone of calcification is where the mineral is deposited in the matrix, and that is temporary support for the cartilage. But then finally, in the bottom layer or zone, the chondrocytes are dying, and those columns fill with the osteoblasts and blood vessels. So this is where the cartilage is technically calcified, and osteons and spongy bone are created. Again, here's what it looks like, but I would not ask you to be able to identify each of those zones. I think that they kind of all look the same. I mean, you can see where there's cell proliferation, there's more cartilage cells, and then you can kind of see the difference in where the number 5, that zone of bone deposition, it looks very different than the cartilage, but I think overall just know the steps or the areas, but we're not going to visually have to identify them. Okay, so we know that bones are increasing in length, and technically that's called interstitial growth, but a lot of times we just use the term bone elongation, but really it's a result of cartilage growth within the epiphyseal plate. And so that plate we talked about closes when the cartilage is gone, and then it's replaced with what's called an epiphyseal line. At that point, the lengthwise growth is finished. So this occurs at different ages in different bones. The other type of bone growth is width, and that's called appositional growth. And so bones are increasing in width throughout our life. The new bone is deposited at the surface. So the osteoblasts on the deep side of the periosteum deposit the tissue, and they become trapped as the tissue calcifies. And so this is what enlarges the bone in width. The osteoclasts of the endosteum are what enlarges the marrow cavity. So our bones are remodeled 10% per year throughout our life. This includes repairs and microfractures. We're going to talk about releasing minerals, but the bones reshape based on their use and disuse. This talks about some disorders with pertaining to bone elongation. So if we see certain types of dwarfism, we can expect that that has to do with bones not growing. So long bones stop growing during childhood. In this androchondroplastic dwarfism, that's probably the most common type. The cartilage is not growing. So this has to do with a mutation in alleles. It is inherited. But then there's other types of dwarfism. Pituitary dwarfism is when there's a lack of a growth hormone. So their bones have normal proportions, but overall a short stature. So the main point of this video, we're going to talk about the physiology. So basically what the bone is doing. And so a mature bone is metabolically active. It has to do with its own maintenance and growth and remodeling, but also has to do with exchanging minerals. And so we're going to talk a little bit about calcium. So the calcium homeostasis, remember homeostasis means a stable internal environment, that the bone is in charge of keeping that calcium level within a happy range. And so when that calcium gets too high or too low, it could disrupt function in other organ tissues or organ systems, especially the nervous and the muscular systems. So we're going to talk about two processes. The first is mineral deposition. So we may call it mineralization, but we may just call it deposition, is depositing the minerals. So a lot of times we're going to use the term mineral, but mostly focus on calcium. So this is a process where calcium phosphate is taken from the blood and deposited into the bone. Okay, so from the blood into the bone. The osteoblasts produce fibers that spiral the length of the osteon, and those fibers are where the minerals collect and they harden in the matrix. So again, mostly we're going to talk about calcium, but calcium phosphate would include calcium and phosphorus and oxygen. And so they are deposited along those fibers. The ion concentration of those calciums and phosphates have to reach a critical value for the crystals to form. So some tissues have inhibitors to prevent this so that they don't become calcified. Most tissues, all the tissues except for bone, I guess I should say. But osteoblasts basically neutralize these inhibitors. And so in that type of tissue where osteoblasts are occurring, the calcification can occur. Okay, so this talks about when there's calcification where we don't want it. That's called ectopic ossification. It could occur in the lungs, brain, eyes, muscles, tendons. So when calcium is being deposited where it should not. So that can occur. And then the opposite of deposition is resorption. And we talked about this in the first video, I believe. So mineral resorption, you can think about it as reabsorption. It's the process of dissolving bone and releasing minerals. Okay, so releasing minerals into the blood. This is performed by osteoclasts. And again, I just want you to kind of know overview of these two processes. I don't need you to be so in depth about all of the little steps of mineral resorption because there's a lot. But the process of dissolving bone and releasing minerals back into the blood. Okay, so this talks about a practical application. If we want our braces to reposition the teeth are going to move because the osteoclasts are dissolving the bone ahead of the tooth. And then the osteoblasts deposit the bone more slowly in the zone behind the tooth. So this is occurring in response to stress. But calcium and phosphate are needed for more than just bone structure. Phosphate is a component of DNA, RNA, ATP, which is our energy, and phospholipids, what make up the cell membrane. So we absolutely have to have the correct level of calcium for all of our cells to be able to use it for what they need. Calcium is also needed for neuron communication, muscle contraction, that's a big one, blood clotting, and exocytosis. So the minerals are deposited in the skeleton and then withdrawn when they are needed for other purposes. So this talks about regular levels of calcium, 1,100 grams in the adult body, 99% of that is in the skeleton, but then really 18% of that adult skeleton is exchanged with the blood each year. So they are easily exchangeable calcium ions, and they're just pulled out of those reserves when needed. The normal calcium concentration in the plasma is anywhere from 9.2 to 10.4 milligrams per deciliter.